Hello everyone, this is Nitpicking Nerd, and today's theory video will be about horses in Star Trek and possibly robotic horses in Star Trek. This is something I'm going to discuss based on all the evidence from the Star Trek show and a lot of imagination on my part, so this is just for fun video. And this is a topic that occurred to me when I rewatched the episode Home Front in season 4 of Deep Space Nine, and I noticed that almost every time we see Cisco's restaurant, and even in season 7 we saw the exact same horse carriage with the exact same horse passing by that restaurant again. Now obviously that one was simply recycled footage, so maybe we should ignore it, but even if we look just at the episode Home Front, we keep seeing that same exact horse passing in that same street. Both in daytime and even at nighttime we see that same exact horse. And in the nighttime scene we even see the driver is apparently asleep, he's hunched over. And that's the biggest clue for my theory that maybe both the horse and the driver are actually artificial, maybe they're simply robots, we don't really get a close look at them. But I think that might be the most interesting explanation for this. And of course the problem with horses is mainly because in TNG especially they kept saying how they don't enslave animals anymore. On the other hand, we do know that Picard loves to ride horses, and he tries to ride real ones whenever he can. Like in the episode Starship Mine, once he heard about horses being on the planet, he immediately went back to the ship to get his saddle to go and ride real horses. I guess because real horses are more interesting than holodeck horses. Or maybe it was all just excuse to get away from Commander Hatch, who was known for his verbal diarrhea, and so maybe that's the reason here anyway. And of course it was all on an alien planet, so we don't really know if horse riding is still common on Earth, but I guess so, because we saw Kirk riding horses in what I assume was a simulation of Earth. And Picard somehow knew how to ride horses, presumably before he had the holodeck of the Enterprise, which was brand new technology in TNG. So where did he learn that, if not on Earth? And so based on all that evidence, horse riding was still practiced. And that line by Riker saying that animals are no longer enslaved, he was specifically talking about food in that episode. And even that was contradicted later by Riker himself, who was bragging about fishing and cooking real eggs and stuff like that. So he himself was using real animal products later on in the show. So I guess when he said we no longer enslave animals, he was only talking about factory farming. And he was fine with hunting animals, and we also saw that in the new Picard show, that even his daughter was hunting animals for him, and he was okay with that. And so presumably only industrial farming is no longer practiced because of its cruelty, but animals can still be out in nature and it's okay to hunt them for food, I guess in specific conditions and so on. And horse riding was apparently still popular, as we saw with Picard and Kirk. And we also know that a lot of people who live on Earth have jobs which are basically entertainment for other people, so material needs are no longer a priority. So technically I guess people can live for free, but people want to contribute something back to the society. So people work in all kinds of jobs, like in a restaurant, like being a waiter. Even on the Enterprise we have a bunch of waiters in 10 Forward who presumably just wanted to be out in space, and so they agreed to be waiters, to serve on a starship and to go on the adventures without actually being an officer, and they're happily doing their job of being waiters and so on. So I think it's reasonable to assume that someone just loves to be the driver of that horse carriage and to drive people around, simply for fun, maybe not every day, maybe not for long. And so we can assume that was actually a real horse who is well groomed, well taken care of, and it only works for a short time, and most of its time it's living in some good conditions, and so the horse is almost entirely free, and only once in a while it's been taken to the city to drive people around. And I think that would be totally okay morally, as long as the horse is well taken care of and most of its time it lives in good conditions and the driver himself is doing a job for fun. So nothing wrong with it being a real horse and a real person. However, what really got me thinking was that scene in nighttime when we see the driver sitting strangely hunched over as if he's sleeping, and that makes little sense to me. Why doesn't he simply go home? Why do we see him day and night in the same area? And why is he sitting like that, sleeping on the job? So that's the point in which I started kind of thinking that maybe this is not a real person at all, maybe this is some sort of android, and maybe the horse itself is also artificial. even though we did see the horse move a little bit in that scene of the officers beaming down at night. But maybe it's simply programmed to behave like that, like a real horse, even when it's standing still. And if they are indeed artificial, that would explain why we see them day and night for years apparently, and the horse looks exactly the same. And when the carriage is not occupied with passengers, the driver simply pretends to be asleep, to be resting. And if a passenger gets on the carriage, then he will immediately wake up and take him wherever he wants to go. And all of this would explain why we see the same exact footage repeating itself, always this carriage driving by the same exact way, because it's all being programmed. So I kind of like this theory because it solves the question about animal slavery. So the horse is not real, so there's no problem, and the driver himself also not a real person, and so he can be driving around all day long. And I assume the android is not sentient, it's simply performing a very simple function and maybe doing some small talk with the passengers, but nothing beyond that. And so there's no reason to assume it's any kind of sentient, self-aware android, and so there's no problem of him being so-called enslaved, just like the horse itself. If it's not real, it's not really enslaved in any way, it's simply a machine that looks like a real horse, and the same with that person. Now, some people would say, but we never heard about other androids except Data. Data said he's the only one. Well, we can assume he meant the only sentient one. And we actually have a bit of evidence that all kinds of robots did exist in the Federation. First of all, in TOS we saw a whole bunch of human-looking androids in various episodes, and so how come Data never talked about them? Well, maybe those androids were simply not sentient, not real people in any way, so he wouldn't really view them as artificial life forms because they're not really alive, they're not sentient. And also there was a scene in Voyager in which B'Elanna was talking about robots in the Federation. She actually encountered the sentient robot in the episode Prototype, and he asked her, does your culture include artificial life forms? And she said, as a matter of fact, it does. And she said that they come in different shapes and sizes. Some have limbs, some don't. Most don't have your cognitive abilities. And she's talking to a robot who sounds kind of not as smart as Data, but still kind of self-aware and sentient, but not as human as Data. And this robot asks her, are they your servants? And she says, you could say that the robots we use are servants in a manner of speaking, but they aren't sentient like you. In fact, we have only one sentient artificial life form in our society, and he is treated the same as any human. He works on a ship just like you and I, he wears the same uniform I do, he has a name like the rest of us, Data. So based on this piece of dialogue, we know that the Federation does use all kinds of robots, and only Data is considered sentient and having human rights and all of that. So all the other robots are basically servants, and some might look like humans, others would not look like humans, and obviously they have the holograms and all of that, that's a whole other topic. And none of those have any kind of human rights except for Data, who is an exception. He's so intelligent, he's so sentient, that after that hearing in season 2 of TNG, he was declared basically a person with rights. There was also an episode about the robots called exocoms, and Data discovered that they might be sentient as well, but that issue was never fully resolved. So we don't really know what happened with them, but we can assume the Federation is using all kinds of robots like that, but most of them are simply not sentient. They would not be treated like a person, maybe they would be treated the same as animals. So just like animals have certain rights, maybe certain robots who have some limited amount of sentience, maybe they would be treated as animals, meaning they would not be abused, it would be illegal to abuse them if they are capable of any kind of even limited amount of suffering. This issue was not really explored that well. We rarely see any kind of robots in Star Trek, unfortunately, so we don't really have enough evidence, so we only dealt with all these androids, and in the case of Data, he's basically a person, and there were a few episodes dealing directly with those topics. And I think we can assume that there were many other, even human-looking robots all over the Federation, but if they were not really sentient, they were not treated as people, and I don't even think it's a problem if they really have no sentience of any kind, and they're incapable of independent thinking and all of that. And of course, all of this would explain who is doing all the dirty work. I mean, someone has to clean things, someone has to do all kinds of manual labor that people wouldn't want to do. I mean, I can buy the idea of people owning a restaurant or even riding a horse carriage for fun, But who would be the one, cleaning up after the horse? Who would be doing the really dirty job that I'm sure still needs some doing? And so if they actually have all kinds of robots, that would neatly explain that. So simply we don't see that, but there are all kinds of robots cleaning up and doing all the dirty work. We even had a line in TNG Season 2 when Riker said the ship cleans itself, that people don't need to clean the ship. And yet we never saw that happen, and so maybe it's some sort of transporter beam sweeping over the ship and cleaning it, or maybe some sort of robots are doing it off screen, maybe during the night shift when no one sees it, and so on. And I think that would be okay. I think the only reason they didn't show that, they didn't have enough budget for special effects, but I think we can assume it was always there. And since they're not sentient, then no one has any kind of problem with that, and I wouldn't have either. And so I think it's very possible that horse was artificial and the driver also. They were both synthetic and only programmed to do the specific function, and so they wouldn't be considered sentient by anyone, and it's not a problem in my opinion. Their brains are not positronic, they don't have the potential to become sentient like Data, and so there's literally no problem. And all of this brings me to the new Picard show, in which we saw a bunch of new synthetics based on Data, and therefore with the potential to become as sentient as Data, and yet people were treating them as slaves, as not real people, and were insulting them and all of that, which kind of rubbed me the wrong way when I saw it in Star Trek Picard. But if we assume that maybe there were a whole bunch of androids and robots all over the place, like this horse carriage guy who was artificial, then maybe it would explain that kind of attitude we saw by so many people on Mars, the way they talked about the androids. Maybe if they're used to androids being all over the place and being not real people, being just objects, just machines, then maybe it would explain the attitude that we see them having toward these newer androids. And even Picard and Dr. Gerati specifically said that these new androids, even though they were made from before by the designs of Dr. Sung, which means they have positronic brains, but they specifically said that no other synth has been as intelligent as Data, and so we can assume that maybe the androids we saw on Mars are not really sentient. And if all the humans we saw there were used to having all kinds of not sentient androids on Earth, then it would explain the attitude they had toward these new androids as well. And these people never met Data, they never saw how intelligent, how sentient, how much like a person he was, and so they wouldn't have that unique experience, and so there would be no reason for them not to treat all androids like objects, as they were used to do that even before, during the time of Deep Space Nine, if we assume this theory of the driver being synthetic is correct. And so that would kind of explain away that attitude we saw, which I don't like. And I still don't like that attitude, because in the older Star Trek shows we saw some people being polite even toward the replicators and the ship's computer. They were saying please and thank you even to a replicator. At least some people did. And I always thought that's really nice, that's really cute, that really shows how polite these people are, that they are polite even toward machines. On the other hand, it might be kind of stupid as well if it's just a replicator, just a food slot basically, talking to it like a person might be kind of strange. But at least it did feel kind of polite. When people are used to being polite even toward the machines, then they would definitely be polite toward other people. And it's one of the reasons I really love the older Star Trek shows, because people were more enlightened, they were being more polite, they were nicer people, and it was kind of a nicer environment. It's a place I would want to live in, compared to these new Star Trek shows in which people are cursing and people are nasty all the time and all of that, which is less appealing to me, and also it's less educational for kids watching. Kids watching the older Star Trek shows would get better messages, they would see better role models of people being polite and nice, even toward the artificial intelligence. But in the new Star Trek shows, they just treat them as slaves and insult them and make fun of them. So it still kind of annoys me, even if I assume that these new androids were not sentient at all. If it's simply totally like an object, like a computer, I would still not want people to be talking like that to anyone. And so I still have a problem with that scene in the new Picard show, but at least I can kind of explain it to myself, why are they behaving like that, by assuming that maybe there were all kinds of androids and machines and robots even on Earth at the time of Deep Space Nine, and so for all their lives they were used to having synthetics all over the place, and suddenly someone makes this newer model of a more intelligent machine, but they don't really see any real signs of self-awareness and sentience, and so they keep treating it just like they did with all the other machines that they saw all throughout their lives, and they never met Data, and so that kind of makes it more understandable, even though I still don't really like it. And I wish the Picard show would have dealt with this topic more directly, because it was only hinted at, but they never really explored this topic. We know that those androids were simply hacked by the Romulans, so it was not a real rebellion by them. It was not because they were treated as slaves, which would have been much more interesting storyline if it was an actual android rebellion because of the conditions they put them in and so on, because of them being enslaved. But it was not the case, and it was never really dealt with. So we don't really know how sentient were those androids. Were they actually being mistreated? Were they deserving of human rights and equality and freedom or not? The show never really explored any of those questions, which could have been interesting, and so I think that was a huge missed opportunity. It was all just left vague, and so what was the point of that scene except kind of annoying us to show that this is kind of a dystopian future in which androids are slaves? And so it all felt like kind of a bastardized version of TNG, in which people cared even about the rights of an android like Data, who is not 100% confirmed to have a soul, basically. Maybe it is all just programming, we don't really know. And yet people gave him the benefit of the doubt and decided that we are going to treat him as a person, and he can explore that question of whether or not he's a real person by himself. We will give him that benefit of the doubt and that freedom to explore that question, and will not force our own viewpoints on him, and will not force him to do anything against his will, and will not threaten his existence. And so TNG was so much more optimistic and enlightened and positive and caring about rights of individuals and people and all of that, and it was far more educational compared to the new Trek shows, which are more dystopian, which always so negative. And if it was used for something in the story, I would be fine with that. If they established it as they did, that there's kind of bigotry against these androids, and then they will actually deal with the topic, and they will show why this was wrong and what it caused, and it will be part of the plot, then I will be fine with that. Especially if it leads to some change to the better in the end, if it reaches to some new understanding, some revolution later on, that would be great. But the show never did that, and so they only showed the negative and then just forgot about all of that, and so we never really got anything from it, and so it was all just pointless, and that's annoying. But anyway, this is turning into another rant against Star Trek Picard. But I think the idea of androids, obviously it's a classic science fiction idea, which is fascinating because of that whole topic of at what point does an AI become an actual sentience, or is it just a simulation? What does that mean about ourselves, about our consciousness? Our own brains are also electrical, so what does that mean about us? And if advanced machines don't have a soul, so maybe we also don't have one, maybe we don't really have a free will, maybe it's all pre-programmed just like a simulation, and all dependent on purely physical, numerical things you can calculate, and so we are no more than machines ourselves. So this whole topic opens all these philosophical, existential questions, and these are the types of questions that, in my opinion, is what makes science fiction interesting. All of these philosophical questions that we don't really have an answer for yet, and maybe never will, but it's really fascinating to think about and to debate about. And it ties to so many other existential questions, and that's what makes it so interesting. So that's all I wanted to talk about for today. Let me know what you think, and we can continue the discussion in the comment section below, and I will see you all next time. Bye bye.